I knew my marriage was over the moment my husband called another woman family, and that woman was the one who had held my hand through 40 years of birthdays, funerals, and quiet afternoons over tea. The words slipped out of him so naturally that for a second I wondered if I had imagined it. We were gathered in our dining room that Sunday evening. The curtains were half drawn against the fading autumn light, and the smell of rosemary chicken still lingered in the air. My husband, Arthur, sat at the head of the table, his glasses low on his nose as always. Across from me was Lillian, my best friend since I was 24 years old. She was laughing at something Arthur had just said, her hand resting lightly near his sleeve. I remember noticing that small detail, not touching, just close enough. After all, Arthur said, reaching for his water, Lillian isn't just a friend anymore, she's family. The fork slipped from my fingers and struck the plate with a sharp, lonely sound. No one spoke. Lillian's smile froze first. Then Arthur looked at me, confusion knitting his brows as if I were the one behaving strangely. What do you mean, family? I asked. My voice sounded thin like paper. Arthur opened his mouth, then closed it again. A faint redness crept up his neck. Oh, Journey, he said finally, forcing a chuckle. You know what I mean, she's been in our lives forever. But he would not meet my eyes, and in that silence, heavy, unnatural, something old and instinctive stirred inside me. The same quiet awareness I had felt the night my father died, when the house seemed perfectly normal but the air had already changed. I did not argue. I did not accuse. At 65, you learn that the loudest truths often arrive without raising their voices. Instead, I folded my napkin carefully onto the table and said, "Excuse me, I think I need some air." Outside, the evening smelled of damp leaves and distant chimney smoke. My hands trembled as I gripped the porch railing. Family. Arthur had chosen that word deliberately. And somewhere deep within me, a door I did not know existed had begun to open. Before that night, my life had been ordinary in the way I once believed was unshakable. Arthur and I had been married 42 years. We met when I was 22, working part-time at the public library while finishing my teaching certificate. He was quiet even then, the sort of man who listened more than he spoke. On our third date, he brought me a single white tulip because he remembered I had once mentioned they felt less showy than roses. I married him because I trusted him, not because he dazzled me. Trust, I believed, was the sturdier foundation. We built our life slowly, a modest brick house on Alder Street, 2 children, countless routines that stitched the years together. Saturday grocery trips, shared morning coffee, the soft whistle he made when reading the newspaper. Love in long marriages is rarely dramatic. It is the steady presence of another toothbrush beside yours. Lillian entered my life 2 years after Arthur did. She had just moved into the neighborhood, newly divorced, carrying a grief she tried to disguise with bright scarves and louder laughter than necessary. I invited her over for tea one afternoon, noticing how her hands shook slightly when she lifted the cup. From that day forward, she became part of my rhythm. She never remarried. Once was enough, she used to joke. Our children called her Aunt Lillian. She attended every holiday, every graduation. When my mother passed, she slept on our couch for a week so I would not wake up alone. There are friendships that feel chosen, and others that feel ordained. I never questioned her closeness with Arthur. Why would I? They shared the comfortable politeness of 2 people connected through me. He fixed a leak in her kitchen once. She baked his favorite lemon loaf every spring. Normal things, safe things. Looking back now, I realize betrayal rarely announces itself with thunder. It grows quietly in familiar soil. The first shift was so small I nearly missed it. About a year before that dinner, Arthur began volunteering to drive Lillian home after our gatherings. "It's dark," he'd say, already reaching for his keys. At first, I appreciated the kindness. Then I noticed the drives grew longer. "She likes to talk," he explained once, loosening his tie when he returned. Didn't want to cut her off mid-story. Another time, I caught the faint scent of her jasmine perfume on his coat. I told myself it must have lingered from a goodbye hug. People who trust deeply are often the last to see what is changing. There were phone calls, too, brief ones. He'd step into the hallway, his voice lowered but not secretive enough to justify suspicion. When I asked who it was, he answered easily. "Lillian needed the number of our plumber. Lillian was asking about your soup recipe. Lillian wanted advice about her taxes." Each explanation perfectly reasonable, each one filed away by a part of me that preferred peace over doubt. At 65, you do not go searching for storms. You assume the weather you have is the weather you will keep. Yet there were moments, flickers, when something unsettled me. One afternoon, I came home early from the market and found them standing in the kitchen. They moved apart too quickly when I entered, like teenagers caught whispering. Arthur laughed. "Look who's back sooner than expected." Lillian smiled, but it did not quite reach her eyes. "We were just talking about the garden," she said. I nodded, placing the groceries down with deliberate calm. Even then, I chose not to ask why conversation required such closeness. Denial is not foolishness. Sometimes it is self-preservation. After that dinner, after the word family, the memories began rearranging themselves inside me, like furniture dragged into harsh light. I returned to the dining room eventually, my face composed. Lillian was collecting plates. "You shouldn't be working," I told her gently. "You're a guest." She hesitated. "For heaven's sake, Journey," she said softly. "After all these years, you know I'm more than that." Again, that word hovered between us. More. Arthur kept his eyes on his glass. Something cold slid through me then, not anger, not yet, but the unmistakable sensation that I had been living inside a story whose ending everyone knew except me. That night after Lillian left, I stood at the bedroom window watching Arthur brush his teeth. Foam gathered at the corners of his mouth, ordinary and domestic. "How long?" I asked quietly. "Have you considered Lillian family?" He paused. "Too long." Then he rinsed, wiped his mouth, and said, "Journey, don't make something out of nothing." Nothing, the most dangerous word a spouse can use, because it asks you to distrust your own perception. I studied his face, the lines I had memorized over decades, and for the first time I felt like I was looking at a man whose inner life I did not fully know. I slept very little that night. Around 3 in the morning, I heard his phone vibrate softly on the nightstand. Arthur stirred but did not wake. The screen glowed briefly. A single message, from Lillian. "Did you tell her?" My breath stopped. Arthur shifted beside me, unaware that the ground beneath our marriage had just cracked open. I did not touch the phone. I did not wake him. Instead, I lay there until dawn, listening to the steady ticking of the clock, each second carrying me closer to a truth I was no longer sure I wanted to face. Because some betrayals do not begin the day you discover them. They begin the day the person you trusted decides you can live without the truth. And as the first pale light filled our bedroom, one question settled heavily into my chest. What exactly had my husband told her? And what had they both kept from me? I did not confront him the next morning. After 42 years of marriage, you learn that timing matters more than volume. Questions asked too early often invite carefully prepared lies, so I rose quietly, dressed, and went downstairs to make coffee. The kitchen window had fogged from the chill outside, and I traced a small circle through the condensation with my fingertip, watching the maple tree shed another leaf. Everything looked exactly as it always had, and yet nothing felt the same. Arthur came down 10 minutes later, freshly shaved, humming under his breath, the same tuneless hum he had carried through most of our married life. "Morning," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. I almost flinched. Almost. "Morning," I replied, sliding his mug toward him. He opened the newspaper. I buttered toast. The radio murmured about traffic and weather, domestic peace perfectly staged. If he was nervous about the message I had seen, he hid it well. But then, Arthur had always been good at maintaining surfaces. I watched his hands as he turned the pages. Steady, untroubled. I wondered how long deception could live inside a person without altering their reflection. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked suddenly, glancing up. "You were quiet last night." I was tired, not a lie. Just not the entire truth. He studied me for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded. "We've been meaning to clean the garage," he said. "Maybe this weekend." There it was, the gentle pivot toward normalcy. Arthur did not like emotional terrain. He preferred projects, repairs, practical things with visible outcomes. For decades, I had appreciated that about him. Now it unsettled me. Later that afternoon, I called Lillian. My fingers hovered over her name longer than I care to admit. When she answered, her voice carried its usual warmth. "Journey. I was just thinking about you." I closed my eyes briefly. "Were you?" A pause, barely perceptible. "Yes, of course. Is everything all right?" "I wanted to ask you something," I said carefully. "Last night when Arthur called you family, what did he mean by that?" Silence hummed between us, then she gave a small laugh. "Oh, you know Arthur, he gets sentimental as he ages." Sentimental. Arthur was many things, sentimental was not one of them. You received a message from him later, I added softly. The line went very still. How did you? She stopped herself, and in that unfinished question I heard confirmation louder than any confession. I was awake, I said. Another pause, then her tone shifted, not cold, not defensive, but measured, like someone stepping carefully across thin ice. You shouldn't read into things, Journey. I didn't read anything, I replied. I saw your name, that was enough. She exhaled slowly. I think perhaps we should talk in person. My stomach tightened. About what? Let's have lunch tomorrow, she said gently. There are some conversations that deserve a table, not a telephone. Deserve, the word echoed uneasily. All right, I said. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, listening to the refrigerator cycle on and off. Somewhere deep inside, a knowing had begun to gather, not fully formed, but undeniable. Like the first distant roll of thunder. That evening, I decided to do something I had never done in our entire marriage. I looked through Arthur's phone, not secretly, not trembling like a thief. Simply, deliberately. He was in the shower when I picked it up from the dresser. The device felt strangely heavy in my palm, as if it carried more than circuits and glass. For a moment I almost set it back down. Trust, once broken by suspicion, still resists its own collapse. But then I remembered the message. Did you tell her? The phone unlocked easily. Arthur had never believed in passwords between spouses. A gesture that once signified transparency now felt almost ironic. Their thread was not long, at least not recently. A scattering of practical exchanges, doctor appointments, grocery recommendations, photos of her new curtains, ordinary, too ordinary. Because what was missing spoke louder than what remained. There were gaps, weeks where no messages existed at all, unusual for two people who supposedly needed plumbers and recipes so often. People who are hiding something rarely erase everything. They erase just enough. I scrolled further back. And then I found it, a message from nearly 2 years ago. Same time as always, Arthur's reply, yes, she volunteers on Thursdays. My chest tightened. Thursdays. For 15 years I had volunteered at the Community Literacy Center every Thursday morning. I tried to steady my breathing. Another message. I hate lying to her. Arthur had written, we're not lying. We're protecting what matters, protecting what matters. I set the phone down slowly. The bathroom water shut off. Pipes rattled softly in the walls. I walked to the window before he emerged, forcing my face into calm. When Arthur stepped into the bedroom, towel slung low around his waist, he smiled. Beautiful sunset, he said. I nodded. Yes, I answered, but all I could see was the horizon splitting open. Lunch with Lillian was set for noon at the small cafe we had frequented for years, the one with mismatched china and lavender sachets tucked near the register. She was already seated when I arrived. For the first time since I had known her, she looked fragile, not physically. But morally, her posture was too straight, her hands folded too tightly atop the table. Journey, she said softly. I sat across from her. Up close, I noticed faint shadows beneath her eyes. Tell me the truth, I said, no preamble, no pleasantries. She looked down at her teacup. I always wondered how this moment would arrive, she whispered. The air left my lungs. So there is a moment, I said. She nodded once. A tear slid down her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. How long? I asked. Her lips trembled. 23 years. For a second I thought I had misheard. 23? She closed her eyes. We never meant for it to begin that way. The cafe sounds faded, clinking spoons, low conversations, all dissolving into a distant blur. You're telling me, I said slowly, that while I was raising children, building a life, hosting holidays, my voice broke despite my effort, you were with my husband? She reached across the table. I pulled my hand back. Don't, I said quietly. She nodded, withdrawing. He told me he loved you, she whispered. He always has. The cruelty of that sentence stunned me, as if love were a loaf one could slice and distribute. Then what was this? I demanded. Her gaze met mine, filled with something that looked terribly like shame. A marriage, she said. The word struck harder than a slap. I stared at her. That's impossible. It wasn't legal at first, she rushed on. Just a private ceremony. A friend officiated. Years later, when he traveled for that conference in Santa Fe, we made it official there. Santa Fe, the conference he had attended alone. I remembered ironing his shirts for that trip, remembered slipping a note into his suitcase that read, "Come home soon." My hands began to shake. Does anyone else know? No, she said quickly. We agreed it would only ever be us. Us, the audacity of that small word nearly stole my breath. Why tell me now? I asked, her composure finally cracked. Because Arthur wants us all together, she sobbed softly. He's tired of dividing his life. He thought at our age perhaps you could accept it. Accept it? The room tilted. Accept that my best friend and my husband have been living a second marriage behind my back? She wept openly now. We never wanted to hurt you. I stood slowly. Intent, I said, my voice eerily calm, does not erase betrayal. As I turned to leave, she whispered, he loves you, Journey. I paused. Without looking back, I said, love without honesty is not love, it is convenience. Outside, the winter air struck my face like cold water. I walked without direction for nearly an hour, my mind assembling memories into a pattern I could no longer deny. Every late meeting, every solo trip, every Thursday morning. 23 years, nearly half my marriage. Yet beneath the devastation, something unexpected began to rise. Not hysteria, not even rage, clarity. Because when a life built on trust collapses, you are granted a rare, terrible gift, the freedom to decide what comes next. That evening, Arthur found me sitting in the living room, hands folded calmly in my lap. He knew immediately. You spoke to her, he said. Yes. He sank into the chair opposite me, the weight of decades suddenly visible in his posture. I was going to tell you. When? I asked. He hesitated. Soon. I studied him, this man I had loved since girlhood, and realized I was looking at a stranger wearing my husband's face. Tell me something honestly, I said. Anything? Were you ever planning to choose? He swallowed. I already did, he said quietly. The answer settled between us like ash, and in that moment I understood something with piercing certainty. The marriage I believed I had was already gone. What remained was the question of how I would walk out of its ruins. I did not cry that night. Strangely, my tears seemed to have retreated somewhere beyond reach, as if my body understood that collapse would not serve me now. Instead, I sat very still and listened to the sound of Arthur breathing across from me. 42 years. I had once believed that length alone created safety. Now I understood time only deepens whatever truth already exists. You chose, I repeated quietly, and yet you stayed. Arthur rubbed his palms together, a nervous habit I had seen only a handful of times, once when our son needed surgery, another when we nearly lost the house during the recession. Life isn't as simple as choosing one person, he said. No, I replied evenly. But it is simple enough to choose honesty. He closed his eyes briefly. I loved her differently. The sentence entered my chest like winter air. Different, not less, not mistaken, different. How generous of you, I said softly, to offer each of us our own category of love. His shoulders sagged. You were my foundation, Journey, my history, the mother of my children. And she, he hesitated. Peace, he whispered. The cruelty of that word nearly made me laugh. Peace built from deception. Did you ever consider, I asked, that I might have been peaceful too if you had not fractured my reality? He did not answer, because there was no answer that did not condemn him. That night I moved into the guest room, not dramatically, not with slamming doors. I simply gathered a pillow, my robe, and the novel I had been pretending to read for weeks. Arthur followed me down the hallway. Please don't do this, he said. Don't do what? Create distance. I turned to him then. Arthur, the distance was created 23 years ago. I am only now seeing it. He reached for my hand. I stepped back. For the first time since our early dating years, we stood without touching. I never stopped caring for you, he said. I believe you, I replied, and I did. That was the tragedy. Arthur was not a cruel man. He was not volatile nor reckless. He was something far more dangerous. He was compartmentalized. The kind of person who builds emotional rooms and convinces himself the walls are soundproof. I need time, I said. How much? I don't know yet. He nodded slowly like a man recognizing a landscape he could not cross. As I closed the guest room door, I noticed my hands were steady. Shock had given way to something quieter, awakening. Sleep did not come easily. Around midnight, I rose and opened the closet in that small room. It still held old coats, spare blankets, a box of photographs I had not sorted in years. I pulled the box down and sat on the floor. Sometimes the past explains the present with painful clarity. The first photograph I lifted showed the four of us at the lake, Arthur beside me, his arm around my waist, Lillian leaning into his shoulder while holding a picnic basket. At the time, it had looked natural. Now I saw the geometry differently. Another photo, my 50th birthday, Arthur lighting candles. Lillian watching him with an expression I could now only describe as intimate. How had I missed it? But as the question surfaced, another followed gently behind, or had I simply trusted too completely to look? There is a difference between blindness and faith. I sat there until the floor chilled my bones, piecing together a mosaic I had never known existed. Trips he couldn't reschedule. Evenings when Lillian declined invitations because she already had plans. The conference in Santa Fe. The Thursday errands that stretched too long. Memory is merciless once it begins rearranging itself. The next morning I called my daughter Elaine, not to tell her everything, not yet, but because I needed to hear the voice of someone whose love I did not question. Mom. She answered brightly, "This is early, everything okay?" I hesitated. At 65 you do not expect to become the bearer of catastrophes. "Would you be free for dinner tonight?" I asked. "Of course, should I bring the kids?" "No, just you." Her pause was immediate. "I'll be there." Children, even grown ones, recognize shifts in their parents the way animals sense weather. Arthur left for a walk that afternoon, something he rarely did alone. Perhaps he needed air too. Perhaps guilt had finally found its way into his lungs. While he was gone, I did something else I had never imagined myself capable of. I drove to Lillian's house. The little blue cottage looked exactly as it always had: neat hedges, brass knocker polished to a shine. I had helped her choose that knocker. My stomach tightened. When she opened the door, her eyes widened. "Journey I wasn't expecting." "No," I said calmly. "You weren't expecting me for 23 years. She lowered her gaze. "May I come in?" She stepped aside. The house smelled faintly of vanilla and old books, familiar, comforting. How strange that betrayal could live inside such ordinary walls. I walked slowly through the living room and then I saw it. A photograph on the mantel, Arthur, not one I had taken. He stood beside Lillian in a garden I did not recognize, his hand resting at the small of her back. The intimacy of that gesture was unmistakable. "You displayed this?" I asked quietly. Her voice trembled. "Only when you weren't visiting." Something inside me hardened then, not into cruelty but into resolve. "Show me the rest," I said. She stared at me. "Journey, if I am to rebuild my life," I continued evenly, "I will do so with the full truth, no more fragments." After a long moment she led me down the hallway. The bedroom door opened, and there it was, the final illusion stripped away. 2 pillows worn into familiar shapes. A closet with men's shirts spaced among her dresses. A drawer containing Arthur's watch, the one he claimed to have misplaced years ago. I inhaled slowly. Not a gasp, not a sob, just air entering lungs that suddenly understood survival was still possible. "How often?" I asked. "At first rarely," she whispered, "then more. Especially after he retired. He told you he was golfing." "Golf?" Arthur hated golf. I almost smiled at the absurdity. "Did you love him?" I asked. Her answer came without hesitation. "Yes." "Did you love me?" The question seemed to wound her more deeply. "With all my heart," she said. "I considered that." Then I nodded once. "I believe you loved the version of me that made your life easier," I said gently. "But love that requires deception is not love, it is dependence." Tears slid silently down her face. "What will you do?" she asked. For the first time since this began, I felt something steady rise within me. "I will not compete," I said. "Compete? For a man who divided himself rather than standing whole." I turned toward the door, then paused. "One more question," I added. She waited. "Why did he call you family now?" Her expression faltered. "His heart condition," she said softly. "The doctor found an arrhythmia last month. It frightened him. He said if anything happened, he didn't want me shut out, invisible." So fear, not conscience, had pushed him toward truth. "Thank you, mortality. It has a way of clarifying priorities." I walked out without another word. That evening, Elaine arrived precisely at 6. She took one look at my face and set her purse down slowly. "Mom, what happened?" I gestured toward the sofa. When I finished telling her, not sparing the facts but delivering them calmly, she sat frozen, then anger flooded her eyes. "I'm going to kill him," she whispered. "No," I said firmly, "you will not." "How could he do this to you, to us?" I reached for her hand. "We will not become people ruled by his failure." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Are you leaving him?" I considered the question carefully. "I am leaving the lie," I said. "The rest I will decide with dignity." Just then, the front door opened. Arthur stepped inside and stopped short when he saw Elaine, the room filled with a silence so dense it seemed almost visible. Dad, she said, her voice shaking with fury, tell me it isn't true. He looked at me, I held his gaze steadily. No more secrets, I said. He sank into a chair, and in that moment I realized something with quiet certainty. The man who had balanced two lives for decades was finally standing in a room where every wall was made of truth. There would be no more hiding, only consequences. Part 4 of the script, ~2000 words, reaction/action, choosing dignity over collapse. Arthur looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not physically, he was still the broad-shouldered man who had once lifted both our children at once, but morally diminished, like a structure whose foundation had quietly rotted. Elaine stood near the fireplace, arms folded tightly across her chest. Well, she demanded. Arthur's voice came out hoarse. It's true. The words fell with a dull finality. She let out a sharp breath, half laugh, half sob. For how long? He glanced at me before answering. 23 years. Elaine staggered backward and sat down heavily. That's not an affair, she whispered. That's another life. Another life, yes, not a mistake, not a lapse. A parallel existence running alongside mine like train tracks I had never noticed. I thought you loved Mom, she said, her voice trembling now with something deeper than anger. I do, Arthur replied. The simplicity of his answer ignited something in her. Stop saying that, she snapped. Love doesn't look like this. I watched them quietly, my hands folded in my lap. Strangely, I felt no urge to raise my voice. Pain, when it reaches a certain depth, stops thrashing, it becomes still. Elaine, I said gently, go home tonight, be with your children. I'm not leaving you here with him. I am not fragile, I replied. She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the moment she recognized the shift inside me. Shock had transformed into composure. After a long pause, she nodded, but before she left, she turned to Arthur. You don't get to define this family anymore, she said quietly. Then the door closed behind her. Arthur and I sat in silence for several minutes. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway, each second sounding louder than usual, as though time itself were leaning in to witness what came next. I never wanted to hurt you, he said finally. I almost smiled. That sentence, I said softly, is the anthem of people who hurt others repeatedly. He flinched. I was afraid of losing both of you. You should have been afraid of losing your integrity, I replied. He bowed his head. For a moment, I studied the man I had shared a bed with for 4 decades, searching his face not for the husband I knew, but for the stranger I was only now meeting. Tell me something honestly, I said. He nodded. Were you ever going to tell me if your heart hadn't frightened you? He did not answer immediately, and in that hesitation I found my answer. I see, I said quietly. Journey, please understand, loving her never reduced what I felt for you. Arthur, I interrupted gently, you loved 2 lives because you wanted the comfort of both. That is not depth, that is appetite. He inhaled sharply as if the truth had edges. That night I made my decision, not all of it, but enough to begin. I want you to move out, I said, his head lifted. For how long? I don't know yet. Where would I go? The question almost sounded childlike. I held his gaze. You have another home. The reality of that seemed to strike him fully for the first time. This is still my house, he said quietly. It is, I agreed. Legally, practically, but emotionally you forfeited it long ago. He pressed his fingers to his temples. I never imagined it would come to this. No, I said, because imagination requires confronting consequences. He slept in the den that night. I did not ask him to leave immediately. After 42 years, even separation deserved some measure of grace. But by morning, he had packed a suitcase. At the door, he paused. Are you certain this is what you want? I considered the question. No, I said honestly. What I wanted was the marriage I believed I had. This is simply what remains. He nodded once, then stepped outside. I watched through the window as he placed the suitcase into his car, the same blue sedan we had chosen together after weeks of comparison. Ordinary objects suddenly carry enormous symbolism when a life fractures. As he drove away, I noticed something unexpected. The house did not feel emptier. It felt quieter, as though a low, constant hum had finally ceased. The days that followed were strangely calm. I expected hysteria or at least waves of uncontrollable grief. Instead, my emotions moved like deep water, powerful but measured. On Wednesday morning, I visited a lawyer. Not out of vengeance, out of clarity. Her office smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper. After listening carefully, she folded her hands. You have strong standing, she said. especially given the duration of deception and the existence of another legal marriage. Hearing those words aloud steadied something inside me. This was no longer just heartbreak. It was reality requiring structure. I don't want a war, I told her. Most dignified separations don't begin as wars, she replied. They begin as boundaries. A word I wished I had learned earlier in life. Arthur called 3 days later. I almost let it go to voicemail, but avoidance has never been my nature. Hello, I answered. His voice sounded older. I saw the cardiologist again, he said. They want to run more tests. For a brief moment, concern flickered through me, reflexive, familiar. Compassion does not evaporate simply because trust does. I hope the results are reassuring, I said. He hesitated. Would you come with me? You always steadied me. The request pierced me more deeply than anger could have. Because it revealed something essential. Even now he expected the benefits of the role he had betrayed. No, Arthur, I said gently, that is no longer my place. Silence stretched between us. I don't know how to live without you, he whispered. I closed my eyes. You should have considered that before creating a life that required me not to know it existed. When we hung up, my hands trembled for the first time since the truth emerged, not from doubt, from the sheer gravity of ending a shared lifetime. A week later, Lillian appeared at my door. I knew it was her before opening it. Something in the hesitant knock carried her signature. She looked exhausted. May I come in? She asked softly. I stepped aside. We sat across from each other in the living room that had hosted so many holidays. I never wanted to replace you, she said. You didn't replace me, I replied calmly. You duplicated what should never have been divided. Tears filled her eyes. He's staying with me now, but it doesn't feel the way we imagined. I studied her quietly. Affairs, even long ones, live in a suspended reality. When exposed to daylight, they often lose their enchantment. He's grieving, she continued. So am I. None of this feels like victory. Because it isn't, I said gently. It is simply consequence arriving. She twisted her hands together. Do you hate me? I considered the question carefully. No, I said at last. Hatred is too heavy to carry into old age. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. But I cannot have you in my life anymore. The words landed with a quiet finality. 40 years of friendship ended not with a scream, but with a sentence spoken softly in my own living room. I understand, she whispered. As she rose to leave, she paused at the doorway. You were the best friend I ever had. I met her gaze, and you were mine, I said, which is precisely why the loss is so profound. After she left, I walked through the house slowly, touching familiar surfaces, the banister Arthur had varnished, the kitchen counter where Lillian and I once rolled pie dough. Grief came then, not explosive, just steady tears sliding down a face that had finally allowed itself to feel. Yet beneath the sorrow, something else had taken root. Self-respect. The quiet knowledge that even at 65, life can demand courage you never anticipated, and that meeting that demand is the only path forward. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For the first time since this began, I did not see a woman abandoned. I saw a woman awakening. In the weeks that followed, the truth did what truths inevitably do. It began to travel, not loudly at first, just a quiet ripple moving through the fabric of our family. Elaine knew. Our son Alora learned soon after, his silence on the phone heavier than any shouting could have been. I'm coming over, he said simply. When he arrived, he did not remove his coat. He stood in the middle of the living room, turning slowly as though searching for something familiar that had vanished. Tell me it's not as bad as Elaine said. I met his gaze. It is exactly as bad. He closed his eyes briefly, then nodded once, sharply, like a man bracing against cold water. I keep replaying childhood memories, he admitted. Aunt Lillian at every birthday, every Christmas morning. The title hung painfully in the air. Aunt. Were we the only ones who didn't know? He asked. Yes, his jaw tightened. I feel foolish. I stepped closer and placed my hand on his arm. No, you were children. Trust is not foolish. It is the responsibility of the people who receive it. He swallowed hard. What are you going to do? I am speaking with a lawyer, I said calmly. His shoulders eased slightly as if structure itself offered relief. Good, he said. You deserve fairness. Then after a pause, do you want me to talk to him? I shook my head. Your relationship with your father is yours to decide. I will not script it. Alora nodded, though anger still burned quietly behind his eyes. Before leaving, he hugged me longer than usual, the kind of embrace adult children give when they suddenly understand their parent is human, not unbreakable. "Mom," he murmured, "you're handling this with more grace than I ever could." Grace, perhaps. Or perhaps I simply understood that dignity is the only possession betrayal cannot steal unless you surrender it. The first real tremor beyond the family came at church. Arthur and I had attended the same small stone parish for 30 years. We knew the creak of every pew, the rhythm of every hymn. That Sunday I went alone. Walking down the aisle felt strangely exposed, like entering a room without armor. A few people smiled warmly, others looked curious. News travels fastest along the quiet channels of long-standing communities. After the service, Mrs. Caldwell approached me near the vestibule. Her voice was gentle but edged with concern. "Journey, dear, we haven't seen Arthur. Is he unwell?" For a moment, I considered offering a polite deflection, but something inside me resisted the old instinct to protect his image. "He's living elsewhere now," I said evenly. Understanding flickered across her face, followed quickly by dismay. "Oh my," she squeezed my hand. "If you need anything, I need only your kindness," I replied softly, and that is what most people offered, kindness, not pity. There is a difference, and I learned to recognize it with gratitude. Arthur called again one evening. "I think people know," he said quietly. "They do," I answered. "I feel like I can't step anywhere without being watched." I considered that secrecy creates a private world, I said. Exposure returns us to the shared one. He exhaled slowly. "Lillian is struggling too." The mention of her name no longer felt like a blade, more like an old scar touched unexpectedly. "I imagine she is," I said. After a pause, he added, "We never meant to humiliate you." I almost responded, then stopped myself. Intent was no longer a useful conversation. "What matters now is how we proceed," I said. He grew quiet. "I spoke with an attorney as well." I waited. "I don't want this to become adversarial." "Neither do I," I replied, "but fairness is not hostility." Another silence. Then, unexpectedly, his voice broke. I look back and don't recognize the man who believed he could hold two lives without breaking either. For the first time, I heard something close to remorse unguarded by justification. Growth often arrives late, sometimes very late. "I hope you become someone you recognize again," I said gently. 2 weeks later, the three of us met with a mediator. It was the first time I had sat across from both Arthur and Lillian since everything came into daylight. Strangely, the air held less tension than I expected. Perhaps because illusions were no longer present. Arthur looked older, the strain carving deeper lines around his mouth. Lillian kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. The mediator spoke calmly about assets, timelines, legal steps, practical language for emotional earthquakes. At one point, Arthur cleared his throat. "The house should remain Journey S," he said. "It's where she belongs." I studied him quietly. Not gratitude, but acknowledgement. Fairness matters most when it is freely offered. We discussed finances, retirement accounts, the small cabin we own near the lake. Every decision felt less like dividing property and more like redrawing the map of a life. When the meeting ended, Lillian surprised me by speaking. "I know I forfeited the right to ask anything of you," she said softly, "but I hope one day your memories of me are not only painful." I considered her carefully. "Time softens many things," I replied. "But it does not rewrite them?" She nodded, tears gathering. Arthur walked me to my car afterward. For a moment, we stood beside it like strangers uncertain how to part. "I used to think stability meant nothing would ever change," he said. "Stability," I answered, "means knowing you can survive when it does." He looked at me, really looked, with something like quiet admiration. "I underestimated you. Most people underestimate women who have spent a lifetime holding families together," I said. He almost smiled. Then he whispered, "I am sorry, Journey. The apology was late, but it was real." "I know," I said, and for the first time, hearing it did not reopen the wound, because healing had already begun. Spring arrived slowly that year. One morning, I opened the windows and let the cool air move freely through the house. The silence no longer felt hollow. It felt spacious. I began changing small things, not out of rejection, but renewal. New curtains, a reading chair by the window, fresh paint in the hallway. Each change whispered the same quiet truth: you are allowed to build again. Elaine visited often. Alora called every Sunday. And somewhere in those steady connections, I realized something profound. Arthur had not been the entirety of my life. He had been a chapter, a significant one. But not the final page. Months later, I saw Lillian unexpectedly at the pharmacy. We froze for a brief second, two women bound by decades and divided by one irreversible choice. She looked thinner, quieter. "How are you?" she asked gently. "I am learning peace," I said. She nodded. "So am I, though it comes differently than I imagined." I believed her. Consequences rarely spare anyone completely. Before leaving, she said something that stayed with me long afterward. "You loved him with integrity. I hope you never lose that part of yourself because of us." "I won't," I replied, and I meant it, because betrayal can deform you if you allow it, or it can refine you. The decision is yours. As I stepped back into the sunlight, I felt an unfamiliar lightness. Not joy exactly, but freedom. The kind that comes when you stop asking why something happened, and start asking what new life might be waiting beyond it. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house after a long marriage ends. At first, it feels unnatural, like a song missing its harmony, but over time, I began to notice something surprising. The quiet was not empty, it was restful. For the first few months, I kept expecting grief to ambush me in ordinary moments, while folding laundry or reaching instinctively for a second mug. Sometimes it did, but more often what arrived instead was clarity. I no longer lived inside questions. I lived inside decisions. The legal process moved forward steadily. No theatrics, no courtroom bitterness. Arthur honored his word about the house. The paperwork was signed on a pale morning in early April, sunlight spilling across the attorney's desk. When it was finished, I felt neither triumph nor devastation. Just a gentle internal shift, like a door closing softly behind me. 42 years reduced to signatures and stamped pages. It sounds colder than it is, because what we shared was not erased. It was simply completed. As I stepped outside afterward, I lifted my face toward the sun. For the first time since the truth unraveled, I allowed myself a long, steady breath that did not catch halfway. Freedom, I realized, is sometimes nothing more dramatic than uninterrupted air. I began doing things alone, small at first. A Saturday morning at the farmer's market. Lunch with a woman from my book club I had always liked but never made time to know better. Long walks without needing to inform anyone where I was going. One afternoon, while reorganizing the hall closet, I found my old watercolor set buried behind winter scarves. I had loved painting in my 30s before life grew crowded with obligations. On impulse, I sat up at the kitchen table and began again. The first attempt was clumsy, the second less so. By the third, something inside me loosened. Creation has a way of stitching together parts of the self that grief threatens to unravel. Elaine noticed the paintings during her next visit. "Mom, these are beautiful," she said, lifting one carefully. "I had forgotten how peaceful it feels," I admitted. She studied me for a moment, then smiled softly. "You seem lighter." "I am lighter," I said, not because the past had become less painful, but because I was no longer carrying what did not belong to me. Arthur wrote me a letter that May, not an email. A handwritten letter, 8 pages long, his script slightly less steady than it once was. I made tea before opening it, sensing it deserved unhurried attention. He wrote of regret, not dramatic, self-punishing regret, but the sober kind that comes when a person finally stops defending their choices. He admitted he had mistaken his ability to manage complexity for wisdom. He wrote that loving 2 women had not made his life richer, only divided. One sentence lingered with me long after I finished. "You were the truest home I ever had, and I understood that only after I walked out of it." I did not cry, but I did close my eyes for a long moment. Later that evening, I wrote back, not 8 pages, just 1. I thanked him for the years that had been real. I told him I hoped his remaining life would be guided by honesty, and I forgave him, not aloud, not ceremonially, just ink on paper. Forgiveness, I have learned, is less about the other person and more about refusing to let bitterness take permanent residence in your heart. Summer arrived with unexpected generosity. The maple tree outside my window filled out again, lush and unapologetically alive. One morning, Alora called. "I want you to consider something," he said. "What is it?" "The university near us offers community courses, art history, literature, even travel seminars. You always put your interests on hold for everyone else. Maybe it's your turn now." The idea startled me. At 65, reinvention feels both daring and slightly absurd, yet the thought lingered. 2 weeks later, I enrolled in an art history class. On the first day, I almost turned around at the door, suddenly aware that most of the students were younger. But then a woman with silver braids waved me over. "First time too?" she asked warmly. "Yes, I'm Teresa," she said. I figured if Georgia O'Keeffe could redefine herself later in life, we can at least try something new. I laughed, a full, unguarded laugh that surprised us both. That afternoon, sitting beneath projected images of vast desert paintings, I felt something awaken that had nothing to do with marriage, betrayal, or loss. Curiosity, and with it, possibility. Arthur's health stabilized, though he moved more slowly now. We spoke occasionally, brief, cordial conversations about practical matters, nothing intimate, yet not hostile. Once he said quietly, "You seem well." "I am becoming so," I answered. "I'm glad," he replied, and I believed he meant it. Lillian I saw only once more that year across a crowded garden center. We exchanged a small nod, nothing more. It felt appropriate. Some relationships end not with reconciliation but with respectful distance. And that too can be a form of peace. The greatest surprise came from within. For months I had assumed my identity was inseparable from being a wife. Yet as the seasons turned, I began to see myself differently, not abandoned, not defined by betrayal, but expanded. One evening while washing dishes, it struck me suddenly. I no longer felt like the woman whose husband had another life. I felt like the woman who had reclaimed her own. There is profound strength in that distinction. On my 66th birthday, Elaine and Alora gathered the family for dinner. The grandchildren filled the house with noise and motion, their laughter echoing down hallways that had once held tension. At one point, Elaine lifted her glass. "To Mom," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for showing us what dignity looks like." Everyone echoed the toast. I felt my throat tighten, not from sadness, but from the quiet recognition that something beautiful had survived. Me. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the house returned to stillness, I stepped onto the porch. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from a neighbor's yard. For years, that scent might have stirred painful associations. Now it was simply a fragrance carried on warm wind. Amazing what time can do, amazing what courage can do faster. People sometimes imagine healing as a moment. It is not. It is a series of small permissions you grant yourself, to laugh again, to trust selectively, to imagine a future not shaped by yesterday. Standing there under the soft glow of the porch light, I realized something with sudden certainty. My life had not been ruined, it had been redirected. And often, what feels like an ending is merely life insisting you step into a larger version of yourself. There is a quiet confidence that arrives when you survive something you once believed would destroy you. Not pride, not hardness, just a steady awareness of your own resilience. By autumn, more than a year had passed since the night Arthur called Lillian family. When I thought back to that evening now, it no longer felt like the moment my life shattered. It felt like the moment my life changed direction. And sometimes, direction matters more than permanence. One crisp October morning, I decided to do something that would have seemed impossible to my former self. I traveled alone. Nothing extravagant, just a small coastal town 3 hours north, a place Arthur and I had once planned to visit but never did because something always came up. This time, nothing would. The inn overlooked a quiet stretch of water where gulls skimmed the surface and the horizon seemed endless. On my first evening there, I sat wrapped in a wool blanket on the porch, listening to waves fold gently onto the shore. For decades, my identity had been woven tightly into other people: wife, mother, friend, host, caretaker. Now, sitting there with only the sound of the ocean for company, I asked myself a question I had not considered since girlhood. Who am I when no one is asking anything of me? The answer did not arrive immediately, but the question itself felt like freedom. The next morning, I joined a small walking tour along the cliffs. Our guide, a cheerful man named Robert, spoke with reverence about erosion, how the shoreline reshaped itself constantly under the patient force of water. Change looks violent when it happens quickly, he said, but most transformation is slow enough that we only recognize it after the landscape is already different. His words settled deep within me. Hadn't my own life reshaped itself in much the same way, not overnight, but steadily, unavoidably? Beautifully, even. Later, I lingered behind while the others returned to the inn. Standing at the cliff's edge, I felt the wind press firmly against my coat, insistent but not unkind. For the first time in many months, I spoke aloud to Arthur, though he was nowhere near enough to hear it. Thank you, I whispered into the wind, not for the betrayal, never that, but for the strange awakening it forced. Because sometimes the life we planned must collapse to make room for the life we are meant to inhabit. When I returned home, Elaine noticed the difference immediately. You look radiant, she said, studying my face. I laughed softly. Radiant might be too generous, but I feel awake. She poured us tea and sat across from me. Can I ask you something honestly? Always. Do you ever miss him? The question deserved care. I miss the marriage I believed we had, I said after a moment. But I no longer miss the man who could not live truthfully inside it. Elaine nodded slowly. That sounds like peace. It is, I replied, and it was not the fragile kind. It was the rooted kind, grown from acceptance rather than denial. Not long afterward, Arthur called to tell me he was moving. Lillian and I found a smaller place, he said, closer to the hospital. His voice carried a fatigue I had not heard before. Is your health all right? I asked. Manageable, he answered. Aging has a way of humbling us. There was a pause, then he added quietly, I often think about how differently I might have lived if I'd possessed the courage to be honest sooner. Regret has a particular sound, softer than apology, heavier than memory. I hope you use the years ahead wisely, I said. I am trying. Before we hung up, he said something unexpected. You taught me more about love and leaving with dignity than I understood in all the years you stayed. After the call ended, I sat very still. Not moved toward reconciliation, but touched by the recognition. Sometimes growth continues between people even after their paths separate. Winter approached again, but this time it did not feel symbolic of loss. It felt restful. I decorated the house simply, that Christmas, evergreen branches, white lights, nothing elaborate. On Christmas Eve, Alora arrived early and helped me carry boxes from the attic. As we worked, he said quietly, I was angry at Dad for a long time. I know, I still am some days. But I also see that holding on to anger keeps me tied to a story that's already over. I smiled gently. That is a wise realization. He hesitated. Did you always know how to be this strong? I considered the question carefully. No, I said. Strength is rarely something we possess in advance. More often, it is something we discover because we have no alternative. He nodded, absorbing that. Before bed that night, my grandchildren insisted on hanging a small ornament shaped like a paintbrush, a gift they had chosen themselves. Because Grandma is an artist now, the youngest declared proudly. I laughed, my heart unexpectedly full. Life had not narrowed, it had expanded. Early the following spring, I hosted a small luncheon for several women from my art class. As we sat around the table discussing paintings, travel dreams, books we loved, I realized something almost startling. Every woman there had survived some form of reinvention. Widowhood, divorce, illness, career loss. And yet here we were, laughing, planning museum trips, arguing gently about impressionism versus modern abstraction. Human beings, I thought, are astonishingly capable of beginning again. After they left, I stood in the kitchen holding an empty teacup and felt gratitude rise unexpectedly, not the dramatic kind. Just a quiet thankfulness for ordinary joy. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after everything unraveled, I ran into Lillian once more, this time at the botanical gardens. She looked older, so did I, undoubtedly, but there was something softer in her expression now. We walked together briefly along a path lined with early tulips. How are you? She asked. I am well, she nodded. I'm glad, truly. After a moment she said, Arthur speaks of you with great respect. I hope he speaks of himself with honesty, I replied gently. She gave a faint, sad smile. He is learning. As we reached a fork in the path, we paused. I will always regret the pain we caused you, she said quietly. I believed her. And to my own surprise, I felt no stirring of old wounds. I hope you both live truthfully now, I said. That is all anyone can ask in the end. We parted there not as friends, not as enemies. Simply as two women whose lives had intersected in ways neither could undo. And I understood as I watched her walk away that forgiveness does not always restore relationships. Sometimes it simply releases you from them. That evening, I wrote in my journal, a habit I had picked up after the separation. One sentence lingered on the page long after the ink dried. The worst betrayal of my life became the doorway to the most honest version of myself. Reading it back, I realized it was true. I no longer defined my story by what had been done to me. I defined it by how I chose to live afterward. and that perhaps is the quiet triumph available to all of us no matter our age. There is a misconception people often carry about endings. They imagine them as sharp, a door slammed, a chapter torn out, a final goodbye echoing dramatically down an empty hall. But most endings, I have learned, are much quieter than that. They sound more like acceptance. More like the soft turning of a page. By the time my 67th birthday approached, the story that once threatened to define me had settled into its proper place behind me, not erased, not denied, simply passed, and what lay ahead no longer frightened me, it invited me. On the morning of my birthday, I woke before sunrise. The house was still, wrapped in that gentle pre-dawn hush I had come to cherish. I slipped into a sweater and stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee warming my hands. The sky was just beginning to lighten, a pale wash of lavender stretching slowly toward gold. For a long moment I watched the world awaken. 2 years earlier I might have stood in that same spot wondering how my life had unraveled without my noticing. Now I stood there marveling at something far more important, how beautifully a life can be rewoven when you choose courage over bitterness. Age does something unexpected if you allow it. It clarifies. You begin to understand that peace is not something others grant you. It is something you permit yourself to keep. Later that morning, the doorbell rang. Elaine entered first, balancing a cake box, followed by Alora carrying an armful of tulips, white tulips. I smiled at the sight of them, remembering the single one Arthur had brought me on our third date so many decades ago. For a brief second, nostalgia brushed past me, but it did not linger. Memories no longer had the power to wound. They were simply evidence that I had lived deeply. "Mom," Elaine said, setting the cake down, "you look happier every year." "I am happier," I replied, and the simplicity of that truth filled the room with warmth. The grandchildren burst in moments later, trailing laughter and the faint scent of bubblegum. One of them tugged my sleeve. "Grandma, make a wish this time before you blow the candles out." I chuckled. At my age, I've learned wishes matter less than choices. Still, when the candles flickered before me, I closed my eyes. Not to wish for anything new, but to give thanks for everything that had carried me here. That afternoon, after everyone left and the quiet returned, I did something symbolic without fully planning it. I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, the one that held relics from my marriage, old anniversary cards, photographs, travel brochures from trips we once dreamed of taking. At the bottom lay my wedding ring. I had removed it the day Arthur moved out and never quite decided what to do with it afterward. For a long moment, I held it in my palm. It looked smaller than I remembered. Strange how objects shrink once their meaning changes. I walked to the garden behind the house, the same garden Arthur had helped me plant decades earlier. Near the maple tree, I knelt and pressed the ring gently into the soil, not as an act of anger, not as rejection, but as acknowledgement. Some chapters belong to the earth now, and from earth new things grow. As I covered it with dirt, a breeze moved softly through the branches above me. I felt no sorrow, only completion. A week later, Arthur asked if we could meet. We chose a quiet cafe halfway between our homes, neutral ground for lives that no longer overlapped. When he entered, I noticed immediately how much older he seemed. Not frail, but reflective. Time humbles all of us eventually. "You look well, Journey," he said as he sat down. "So do you," I replied gently, though what I truly saw was a man shaped by consequence. We spoke easily at first about the children, the grandchildren, the small rhythms of daily life. Then he grew quiet. "There's something I've wanted to tell you in person," he said. I waited. "You were the great love of my life," he continued. "I was simply too flawed, too afraid to live in a way that honored that fully." The words did not stir longing, but they did settle somewhere tender. "Thank you for saying that," I answered. He looked down at his hands. "Do you ever regret the years we spent together?" The question surprised me. "No," I said after a moment. "Regret would erase the joy that was real, and much of it was real, Arthur, but so was the betrayal. Both truths can exist." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. After a pause, he said, "You forgave me, didn't you?" "Yes." "How?" I smiled faintly. "Because carrying anger into the final decades of one's life is like insisting on dragging heavy luggage long after the journey has changed." He let out a soft breath that sounded almost like relief. As we parted outside the cafe, he hesitated. "I hope the years ahead are gentle with you." "I don't need them to be gentle," I replied, "only honest." For the first time in a very long while, we embraced not as husband and wife, but as two people who had finally learned the cost of truth. Then we walked in opposite directions, and it felt exactly right. That evening, I returned home and opened every window. Spring air drifted through the rooms, carrying the faint scent of lilacs. Standing there, I reflected on the woman I had been the night everything unraveled. She believed her life was ending. She could not yet see that it was expanding. If I could speak to her now, I would say this: you will survive. You will soften without breaking. You will discover strength you never needed before. And one day, peace will feel more natural than pain. Before I close this chapter, there is something I want to say directly to you, the one listening to my story. If you take nothing else from my life, take this: betrayal does not get to author the rest of your story. You do, even at 65. Even at 70, even when the life you trusted dissolves beneath your feet. Especially then, because it is never too late to reclaim your dignity, never too late to begin again. And never too late to choose a future that is not dictated by someone else's failure to love you honestly. So let me leave you with a question, one I asked myself many times in those early days. If the life you believed in suddenly shattered, would you have the courage to build a new one brick by brick with your own steady hands? Tell me, what would you have done? And if this story touched something in your heart, if it reminded you of your own strength or perhaps strength you are still discovering, consider sharing it with someone who might need that reminder too. Wherever you are in your life tonight, I hope you choose yourself. I hope you choose truth, and above all, I hope you choose peace.